Fantastic. Jeff, there's some water there for you as well, yeah. Okay, brilliant. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's lunchtime lecture. My name is Lucinda Lax, and I'm Senior Curator of 18th Century Collections at the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. It's a special pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Sir Geoff Palmer, OBE, Professor Emeritus in the School of Life Sciences, Heriot-Watt University, a lifelong human rights activist, and now a distinguished historian of Scotland's relations with the Caribbean. Sir Geoff's story is a remarkable one. After his mother left Jamaica for London in 1948 to become a dressmaker, Geoff was brought up by various aunts in Kingston, Jamaica. Shortly before his 15th birthday in 1955, he joined her there and attended school in the city. After he left to start work, he didn't neglect his education. He attended evening classes, and this opened the way for studies at Leicester, Edinburgh and Heriot-Watt universities, where he gained BSc, PhD and DSc degrees respectively. While working as a researcher at the Brewing Research Foundation from 1968 to 1977, he discovered the barley abrasion process, which makes the malting process much more efficient. This led to him being awarded the American Society of Brewing Chemists Award of Distinction, the Nobel Prize of Brewing, in 1998. In 1989, he became the first black university professor in Scotland, and he was knighted in the 2014 New Year's Honours. Sir Geoff's passion for history and human rights activism has proved just as fruitful as his scientific career, leading to numerous publications. These include a critically acclaimed book on the history of slavery, The Enlightenment Abolished, Citizens of Britishness. In 2007, the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire, Geoff was named among the 100 Great Black Britons. Most recently, he featured on the STV programme The People's History Show, discussing Scotland's links to the slave trade and the lesser-known story of Scotland's role in the abolition movement of the 1800s. With new evidence coming to light all the time about the extent of Scotland's involvement in the slave trade, Geoff comes to talk to us today about his work in this area and the hitherto long-forgotten relationship between Scotland and the Caribbean that is one of the main themes of the new Portrait Gallery display, The Remaking of Scotland, Nation, Migration, Globalisation, 1760 to 1860. Entitled Historical Connections, Scotland and the Caribbean, Geoff's lecture will show how every aspect of modern Scotland, including the spheres of political and military action, business, missionary service, and even the arts and culture, was profoundly shaped by colonial activity and slavery in the West Indies. So please join me in welcoming Geoff to the National Galleries of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Listening to that, I can't believe it applies to somebody who lives in Pennycook. However, thank you very much for taking the time to come out this afternoon. I've got about 20 slides, and I want to cover them. So, unlike my students who often say that I never finish a lecture, I'm going to try and finish this one. My first slide, if I can get it right, yes. What I'm going to do, this slide is of a document which is in Register House, just up the road there. And you can see the date, it's 1774. And this is the document, the original document of a case, where in fact in Edinburgh, a Weatherburn, as you will see, Sir John Weatherburn brought back a slave from Jamaica to Scotland, and the slave ran away or decided not to work for him anymore, and Wetherburn took the case to the Court of Sessions in Edinburgh, not far from here. So in 1774, a case was being tried in Edinburgh to decide whether a person owned by John Wetherburn, and John Wetherburn today, his descendants are the Hopes of Hopetoun, Lord Selkirk, and I think it's Lord Wetherburn from Dundee. So what you have is Wetherburn brings his slaves back. The slave's name is Joseph Knight. The Court of Sessions ruled that whilst he could have a slave in Jamaica, that Joseph Knight would be a slave under British law, he could not be a slave in Scotland because in Scottish law there was no aspect of slavery. And it's on that basis Joseph Knight was released. Now, in England, there was a similar case in 1772 with another slave called Somerset. So both in England and Scotland, the ruling was you could not have a slave in Scotland, but it seems a bit of hypocrisy that Britain had 800,000 slaves in the Caribbean at the time. And these are just some of the photo shots from that document, which is in, as I say, Register House. And if you look at the reasoning at the time, the courts of 12 judges in Edinburgh actually were discussing whether, in fact, it was a humane method for Negroes to be slaves because they were framed for that climate. This was written in Edinburgh. And the fact is that that was one of the reasoning, saying, right, black people were built for hot climates, and therefore it's a natural law that they could be slaves. And if you look at another section of the document, it talks about absolute necessity. This is critical, because absolute necessity means that in our self-interest, it was right that a black person should be a slave in the climate because we couldn't do it because we were white and not used to the climate. And it was therefore a law of nature. Absolute necessity, a law of nature. And one of the conclusions, therefore, in the index of this document, it says, slavery in the West Indies is supported by law. And thus, if we go back, you will see that in 1661, British law said a slave had no right to life. This is the Barbagious Slave Code. In 1690, it was legal to trade slaves. And in 1807, of course, we have the abolition of the slave trade. And in 1838, we had the final abolition of slavery. So if we go back, now I'm going to pick up on using some of the pictures which are owned by the gallery, which you were told about, and this is the first time this is being done. And I had no clue that I could do it. But of course, the good thing about academics is that you should set them tasks that they can't do. And this is what the museum has done. But I've tried my best, and I'm going to try and put this together, linking with that history. So we have the so-called justification for slavery. What are the consequences and what happened? If we look, what I've done, I've taken this picture of Leith, and these pictures are in the gallery, in the exhibition. So I've got a picture of Leith, painted in 1826, that's the painter, and I've attached two paintings on the side of it. Now, the bottom one, you would know, that's William Gladstone, 4-time Prime Minister, MP for Midlothian, and his father, John Gladstone, above him. Now, Leith, it was an important part of the slavery because, in fact, ships sailed from Leith to the Caribbean, bringing sugar back. And if you go to Leith, you will see Elb Street, etc. That was where sugar from the Caribbean was refined. And John Gladstone was born in Leith. His son was born in Liverpool, William Gladstone. But John Gladstone, at the end of slavery in 1834, when the slaves were emancipated, 4 years before final ending of slavery, John Gladstone received, in today's money, 83 million for 2,508 slaves. And that's, he was born in Leith, but he ended up in Theatre Cairn in Fask. But John Gladstone, the father of the famous Prime Minister, there's a statue to William Gladstone in the middle of George Square. His father received 83 million in today's money. So Leith is important. I'll come back to Leith again because Leith is linked to Robert Burns and to his his partner friend, Clorinda. So I'll come back to Leith. This is a painting of William Forbes Callender. Now, who was William Forbes Callender? He was a young man from the north who was a coppersmith. And, in fact, he made a fortune by making cauldrons which were used to refine sugar in the Caribbean. So the slaves were producing sugarcane juice, and when I was a child, I used to drink it in Jamaica. You squeeze the sugarcane, you get the juice, and you have to boil it down to produce the sugar. And he made copper vessels. And these copper vessels were used to produce sugar, crystallized sugar. But these copper sheets, which he also produced, were used to line the bottom of warships. And I'll speak about this later, that British warships at the time had copper bottoms, and they were faster than the French and gave the British Navy an advantage. So he became very wealthy from this. In fact, so wealthy, it is recorded, and I've got it down, I don't know how true this is, but he bought the Callender estate in Fife, and he paid for it with a £1,000 note. 100,000 pound note. And when he died, he left 500,000. That's probably about 50 million in today's money. And what he did, he made equipment to progress slavery. This gentleman is very, well, he's famous now. He wasn't well known. However, I've just read a document from Glasgow University, and if you've read the Sunday Times this week, you will have noticed that Glasgow has now looked back at the income they've received from slavery, and that they're going to make a sort of reparative justice by trying to give opportunities to the descendants of slavery from the Caribbean and also from the UK. And on the first page of that document, which they were introducing this document, this gentleman was described. So I was going to talk about him. I knew nothing about him, and I'm reading a document from the university, and he was mentioned in the first section of it. And who is he? He is Robert Cunningham Graham of Gartmore. And why is he painted by Rayburn? You know, Rayburn painted the skater minister. And Duddingston, he's painted by the same painter. Now, who is he? At 17, he went to Jamaica when he was 17 years old. Like a lot of people who went into slavery, women are involved in a very important way because a lot of women were left slave plantations and slave money by either their fathers or their uncles or whatever. So these women were very important in terms of slave masters, because if you marry such a lady, you immediately become very wealthy. And therefore, within this history, there's a lot of examples of this. And therefore, he married the sister of a very wealthy slave master. He then stayed in Jamaica and became very wealthy. He came back to Glasgow, and he was made rector of the university. He actually issued a prize, a literary prize on liberty. And of course, I think the family still have an estate in Renfrewshire called Slave Paradise. Now, what he also did, which I wasn't aware of, I read it in the report, but I didn't know it was true, but again, it was in the Glasgow University report. He brought back a couple of slaves with him, and he sent one back to the Caribbean into slavery to one of his friends or colleagues, and he actually said he would take a good bottle of Madeira in exchange for the slave. So what we have, and these are records in Glasgow University. Glasgow University has a record of this gentleman because he was one of their rectors and donated money to the university. Again, you'll find that people like himself came back who were not very sophisticated when they went into slavery, but when they came back, they bought an elitism, which in fact enabled them to be painted, or they wanted to be painted, by a painter like Raven. Again, this gentleman, again from Scotland, he went to Jamaica as governor in 1782. He was sent as governor. Now, a lot of governors in the Caribbean were sent, especially during Henry Dundas's period, who is St. Andrew Square. He selected people who he wanted to be governors in the Caribbean. Now, General Archibald General Archibald Campbell was sent to Jamaica at a very important time of 1782. 1782 was one of the most important naval battles that the Royal Navy fought. In fact, had Rodney lost in 1782 against the French, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today. The point is that in 1782, the French decided they were going to take Jamaica from Britain. And Jamaica was probably the most profitable piece of land in the empire at the time. This is including America. Jamaica had 300,000 slaves and was providing over 50% of the income of the empire. So Jamaica could not be lost. The French, in April 1782, decided to fight for Jamaica. And Britain sent down Rodney and Hood. Rodney, there's a Rodney Street just behind John Lewis. And Hood is related to the Hood battleship in the war that was destroyed. So Rodney and Hood, as admirals, were sent down to defend Jamaica. And if you look it up, in 2 days, I think, I'm not saying this in a grand way, but they killed and wounded over 3,000 Frenchmen fighting for Jamaica. The point is that these ships were also using copper boats, and in fact, that's where the concept of breaking the line in the Royal Navy comes from, because that was the new tactics used by Rodney to win that battle. Campbell was the governor at the time, and as a form of promotion, he was sent to Madras as governor. He was also governor in Georgia. So what we have is the Caribbean gave status to slave masters, to military people, fighting and to ensure that slavery continued. we have Henry Dundas. His statue is up the road, and I've just received a text from the Edinburgh Council just before I started this lecture to say we have a meeting on the 10th of October at 11 o'clock to discuss what we're going to put on his plaque. Because there was something on his plaque before which wasn't quite, it didn't quite describe who Henry Dundas was or what he did. He actually transported or encouraged the transport of the Scottish martyrs who were trying to get a form of adult suffrage. He also, in fact, attacked San Domingo, which in fact became Haiti, in order to stop Haiti's independence. He lost 40,000 British troops fighting to stop Haiti's independence. But also, he was very, very keen on Jamaica, and he also sent out Lord Balcarras of Balcarras Street in Morningside. He sent out Lord Balcarras to Jamaica in 1795 in order to fight and defeat the Maroons, who were protesting in Jamaica, and he transported 600 of them to Nova Scotia. So Dundas managed the empire during his period. He held about 10 different offices: the War, Navy, Keeper of the Signet, President of the Board of Trade. All these he kept, but what he's really famous for, we think, is that, and which we believe should go on the plaque, that in 1792, William Wilberforce and the abolitionists were fighting hard to abolish the slave trade. And Henry Dundas, quite cleverly, if we could call it that, Parliament would not vote for immediate abolition. And Dundas came up with the deception of saying that the slave trade should be gradually abolished. And that was accepted. And therefore, this kept slavery going, the slave trade going from 1792 to 1807, 15 years. Now, 42,000 British slaves were transported each year. With a 15-year delay, that's 630,000 people were moved into slavery, where they would not have been if it wasn't for the concept of gradual. Now, the point is that we are discussing this at the moment. And one of my colleagues who is in the group actually said I should be removed because I'm saying that if we go back and look at, say, William Pitt, the Prime Minister at the time, who was Dundas's boss, and Pitt was arguing, he was supporting Wilberforce, and Pitt actually described, if you look up Pitt's speeches, and this is probably the most important speech they say Pitt ever made, and he made quite a few. This speech lasted over 4 or 5 hours. And he actually said in that speech about Dundas's concept of gradual, and I'm going to try and quote, it may not be exactly accurate, but William Pitt, the great Prime Minister, said, beware of this gradual concept, because what it means is waiting for a contingency, refusing to act until 1,000 favorable circumstances unite together, while this terrible, enormous evil goes unredressed. And therefore, I don't feel we can put a plaque up about Dundas unless we put in the concept of gradual abolition was his. Now, if we look at, now moving from the pictures of the gallery to, this is a picture in Jamaica. And this is Marshall's Pen, Great House it's called. And this was a slave plantation. And it was owned by Lord Balcarras, who Dundas sent out to Jamaica in 1795 to defeat the Maroons. So Balcarras went to Jamaica, he's Lord Lindsay, went to Jamaica, served as governor, stayed on, and became one of the most voracious slave masters in Jamaica. And this was one of his properties. Now, what is interesting about this property is that in the book which I produced called The Enlightenment, in the 1980s, I went to Jamaica and I was coming out of one of my aunt's house. And my mother, as you were told, left me with her sisters. And I still visited them in Jamaica when they were alive. And when I was leaving in 1985, I opened the cabinet and I picked out some papers because I felt I might as well take the papers because my aunt dies, then I don't have anything about the family. So I just scraped up some papers, took them with me to Edinburgh. And one of the pieces of paper was a receipt. And that's it. That's the receipt for my family. They owned a small piece of land. It's about 30 odd acres. And that's the value of it, $34,000. That's 174 pounds in Jamaica money. So it's not much, but it's a small piece of land. And it's the same name as Balcarres's estate, Marshall Penn. And what I did, I rang my cousin, this is only a month ago, in Jamaica, and I said, where is our Marshall Penn compared to Balcarres's Marshall Penn? And she said, it's next door. And I said, what do you mean next door? She said, yeah, it's, we've got a small bit, and it's only separated by a small bit, but it's the same name. But we don't know how we got it. And I've spoken to a historian since, and he said, your small piece of Marshall Penn was part of Lord Balcarres's estate. And the slaves did not stay on his estate. They stayed in a small village, but went to estate to work each day. So what you're looking at, which I didn't know until, say, a month ago, that I may be probably have been descended from one of Lord Balcarres's slaves. The interesting thing, I did my DNA just for fun without knowing all this. And to my great surprise, I'm 3% Finnish. So you're looking at a Viking from Pennica. Now, I thought, how the hell did I get 3% Finnish genes? But it makes perfect sense. They came through Shetland because the Balcarreses are linked to Shetland. So therefore, my 3% of genes, which human beings were about 99% alike genetically. So my 3% is significant, that I'm probably descended from Lord Balcarres. I think I shall move north, where they still have an estate. Marshall Penn is on the slave compensation list. And therefore, Lord Balcarres, Earl Balcarres, owned, oops, if I can go back, yeah. Earl Balcarres had a stock of 329 cattle, but he also had 289 slaves at that time. And that would be 1832. And by later on, when the numbers were counted, he had 482, and 253 of them were female. So what we have is the compensation list done by London University, so that's 31 and 32. So he had 289 slaves in 1831. And in 1832, he had 482, and he got compensated, just like Gladstone did. I don't know how much he got, but he got compensated for the number of slaves he had, because the slave by law were property. Now, if we then take this gentleman, he was born in Edinburgh. If you go to St. Andrew's Square, there is a plaque to him. He lived in St. Andrew's Square. And he's the gentleman who formed the Edinburgh Literary Review. He, in fact, was an intellectual and also helped Wilberforce to try to abolish the slave trade. It's Henry Peter Brougham. Now, Brougham is important because he also set up London University. So he's had a significant effect, not only on the arts and culture of Edinburgh, but also made a very significant contribution to the abolition of slavery. And he lived quite a long time, so he covered a large period. And in 1838, there was a great debate about whether slavery should end in 1838 or 1840. The whole idea of Dundas is, although he was dead, gradual abolition still persisted after Dundas died in 1811. It still persisted up until 1838. So what we have here, and I've copied this from parliamentary papers. The parliamentary papers describe here Viscount Melbourne, who was Prime Minister. And Viscount Melbourne is trying to extend slavery to 1840. And the debate saying it should end at 1838. And Melbourne is saying, my lords, it is perhaps the greatest experiment that ever was tried by any nation on the face of the globe. If we achieve it successfully, will be one of the greatest exploits that ever was achieved by any nation. Then, for God's sake, my lords, let us be cautious. That's the gradual. Let us not mar the great work by our precipitancy and haste. Now he's saying, let's do it to 1840. Brougham, who was in the House of Lords, challenged him, and Brougham said, power without right is unlawful. He also stated that no race of men have borne so much, and that since 50,000 house slaves would be free in August 1838, to delay the freedom of the additional 300,000 field slaves in Jamaica until 1840 was unjust. People of the mother country, remember the Windrush, should be subjected to equal laws. And therefore, slavery was abolished in 1838. So Brougham had a significant effect on ensuring that slavery didn't last these extra 2 years. And that, since the average life of a field slave was 5 years, a lot of slaves' lives probably were saved by what Brougham did. This is a lady, again, of the example where women were very important in this slavery because they either married men with money or men married them for their money because they owned plantations. And this lady is, sorry, I got that thing wrong. I've got to go back. This lady is Isabel Ewing. And as a boy in Jamaica, the Ewing family owned the Caymanas estate in Spanish Town, in St. Catherine. And who are the Ewings? James Ewing built an acropolis in Glasgow. That's almost his graveyard for he and his friends. The Ewings gave the Trades Hall, in which I'm a member, in Glasgow, he gave the Trades Hall £500. He gave Glasgow University lots of bursaries. And Caymanas was James Ewing's slave estate. The family still owns it, parts of Caymanas. Therefore, she, Isabel Ewing, I'm trying to, I think it's gone off, I think. Oh, yeah. Isabel Ewing married became Mr. Smith, and of course, Mr. Smith was a rich slave trader. When he died, he left her £70,000, which is probably about 7 million, not as much as Gladstone. So what we have is women, which is not discussed by historians, but another very good example of this is Richard Oswald Street in Glasgow, married Mary Ramsay from the north, and she became Mrs. Oswald of Burns's poem, Ode Sacred to the Memory of Mrs. Oswald of Auchencruve. Mrs. Oswald is the wife of the notorious slave master Richard Oswald. And Burns actually wrote a poem about her, and I'll mention that in a couple of minutes. Now, missionaries were also involved in this slavery. So Scottish ministers like the Reverend John Campbell was a director of the London Missionary Society. And this is my church in Jamaica, where I went to, where they had a small church school where we were taught to sing all kinds of Burns songs. And I remember when I went home and my aunt said, "What did you do today in school?" And I said, "We were singing Coming Through the Rye." She says, "Don't you ever say that again." Obviously, she didn't understand it. But of course, it's where I learned to sing and to read in my very early education. And of course, it was obligatory that I went to church 3 times every Sunday until I left Jamaica. The only way I could not go is to tell my aunts I was sick. And of course, that meant taking castor oil. But, and there was a little plaque on the altar of this church. As I said, I left Jamaica in 1955. So between when I was born and 1955, this is where I got my early education, reading the Bible and singing songs. But what was interesting, there was a plaque on the altar. And when I went back to Jamaica in probably the 2000, early 2000, I went to have a look at this plaque, which was on the altar, which I didn't look at when I was a child. And it said, and I swear, it says, "Famous Scottish achievers, James Watt, Robert Burns, Walter Scott." That was the plaque on the altar. It must have been there for over 100 years. So that was my church, and it was started by the London Missionary Society in 1837. The bricks for that church were used to ballast the slave ships who brought sugar to Glasgow, and they had to be ballasted on the way back. So they were ballasted with bricks, and those bricks were used to build the church. Robert Burns. We can't have a talk about slavery in Jamaica without mentioning him, because, to a lot of people's surprise, he bought his ticket to sail to Jamaica in 1786. He didn't go. He was going to sail from Leith, but he didn't go. His book, the Kilmarnock edition, sold, and therefore he had enough financial backing to not have to go to Jamaica. He himself says he was going as a slave driver, because at the time, Burns was aware of the Selkirks. He knew the Weatherburns. He knew of the Cunningham who built the Gallery of Modern Art in 1776. So Burns was aware, like a lot of Scottish young men, doctors, lawyers, surveyors. They had nothing to do in Scotland. There were no opportunities, so slavery provided that. The Articles of the Union, the 25 Articles, Article 4 says you'll be allowed to trade with England, increase your trade with England, and with the plantations in the Dominions. The Union was partly about going to the English slave colonies. And therefore, as soon as the Union was signed in 1707, a lot of Scottish young men, qualified, went to the Caribbean. And therefore, that's why Burns would want to go. I'm giving you some sort of reason or justification. It may not be a justification, but it was where you go to better yourself. And therefore, Burns wanted to go. He didn't go. His girlfriend, Clorinda, she went to Jamaica in 1791. A lot of people are not aware of that. But Clorinda, for whom he wrote A Fond Kiss, as a sort of a goodbye present, she went to Jamaica in 1791, met her husband, and her husband told her he was quite happy with his ebony woman and mahogany children. And that's why she came back. She spent 4 months in Jamaica. And of course, it's like with all stories, you have redemption. So Burns wrote The Slave's Lament in 1792, when he was wanting to go to Jamaica in 1786. And he wrote in The Slave's Lament, "The burden I must bear, while the cruel scourge I fear." He was talking about the slaves' fear of slavery. And of course, in his poem, Ode Sacred to the Memory of Mrs. Oswald of Auchencrew, that is where Richard Oswald, her husband, a young boy from Glasgow, went to Jamaica, was almost encouraged by the grants of Speyside, who are still there, who told Richard Oswald to marry Mary Ramsay because she had just inherited some slave plantations. And Richard Oswald built on that, became one of the richest men in the country. And the British government, after the Battle of 1782 with Rodney, the British were dividing up the world again. And who did they get to represent them in Paris? The slave master, Richard Oswald. He actually gave the French Senegal. So a young lad from Glasgow had the power to give the French a country. Burns, when Mrs. Oswald died, Mrs. Oswald, the funeral of Mrs. Oswald were held in a hotel that Burns was staying in Cumnock, and he got put out of his hotel or his lodgings. He then wrote this poem about Mrs. Oswald. And why I've included it is that poem is, a lot of Scottish people say, well, we didn't quite know what the poem was about. It's about slavery in the Caribbean. And the most powerful description that I've read of avarice and the slavery is in that poem. And it is one line. He said, he describes that she was on an annuity of £10,000 a year. The Oswald's house is still in Auchencrew. I did a film with STV on it. And Burns then wrote about her, she had hands that took, but never gave. And that could be stamped on the plaque of all the slave masters in the Caribbean. And it is in that poem. Hands that took, but never gave. We have, coming to the end, I hope I'm not running over time. No, okay. We have a picture here which some people may say is partly disturbing. But Wilkie is a young man to his own efforts, became a great painter. And what we have, oh there, oh there. Oh, it went back. I'll have to go through them backwards. Oops. Okay, it's probably my fault. That's okay. Yeah, hang on. Yeah. Oops, it seems to be not going back to where it should be. Hang on. Okay, let's see that. We're getting there. That's it, we got it. There you are. Just two to go, one to go. What we have here is Wilkie, a self-portrait. And very ambitious young man. But I think what to me was important about him, he painted that painting. And the date is important. Like all this history, the dates are critical. So he painted himself in 1804, 1805. He painted this painting in 1839, 1 year after the abolition of slavery, but at the height of British colonial power. Now, this is a painting showing, as it said here, Sir David Baird discovering the body of the Sultan Tipu Sahib in Mysore. And this was in May 1799. Now, 1799, the person who controlled the British world was Henry Dundas. And Henry Dundas was president of the Board of Trade. He, in fact, not only controlled slavery in the Caribbean, he controlled colonialism in India. And of course, getting rid of the Sultan was very important. I think he fought 4 wars, and they finally got killed in 1799. And this is Wilkie's imaginative painting of the death of the Sultan, or his body being found. And I think this is a glorification of something which people living in Britain could only have imagined. That imagine a slave in the Caribbean, lifespan is 5 years of a young man. 5 years. And that's why 42,000 slaves had to be traded. The concept of breeding of slaves was also discussed by Dundas. Because gradual abolition, what he said was, if we gradually abolish slavery and attend to their condition during that gradual period, then in fact will be possible to breed them. And therefore we won't need a trade. So we have to have the trade as long as possible until we address the condition. The truth is, he never did anything to address the condition. So therefore, gradual meant forever. And therefore, this aspect of colonialism, when we talked about Dundas, Dundas's view was, well, I'm doing this for the security of the country. What some historians are saying today, he did it for you. And I said, that is not my view. I think he did it for himself. He got himself made a Viscount. And this was late in his life. But as my mother says, well, you always get your comeuppance because God isn't sleeping. And Dundas was actually impeached in 1806, a year after Trafalgar. He was in charge of the Navy. He was impeached for mismanagement of naval funds. And in fact, he was impeached by a brewer. See the irony? All this lecture was planned. He was impeached by Samuel Whitbread, the brewer. The second Samuel Whitbread impeached him. And of course, one historian said to me last Sunday, but he was acquitted. He chose to be tried by his colleagues in the House of Lords, not in the courts. And therefore we have the Scottish people, when I've spoken about from the one end of the country to the other, what lots of people have said to me, and maybe you're different, they've said, why hasn't anybody told us all this before? That they are not aware of the ramifications of the history or the complexities of it, and the nature of how one managed 800,000 people in the Caribbean for over 100 years. It's not 5 years. And therefore, in fact, why we still talk about it, and Glasgow University, I think, has made a momentous sort of decision to say, let's look at my history and see where, in fact, we received funding. And it's not about the money. It's about, you cannot change history, but you can change the consequences of history. And this is what Glasgow is trying to do, and they should be commended for it. And finally, how do we look at all this? A lot of people are not aware that, in fact, the slaves didn't just sit down and take it. In Jamaica, or in the Caribbean, we had the Maroons in 1730 who fought for their freedom. Busa in Barbados fought and was hanged. Taki fought in Jamaica in the 1760s and was hanged. Gladstone took the name of his owner He was transported. Sharp, well known in Jamaica, fought in 1832 and was hanged. And Gordon was of mixed race. His father was white and his mother was a slave. And he and Bogle are very famous in Jamaica today and Sharp because they're now national heroes. They're on the money and the stamps. And Gordon, as I said, was mixed race. These two were both Baptist Christians. And Gordon advised Bogle. Bogle was involved in the fighting in 1865. And in fact, Governor Eyre, and there's an Eyre place down in Leith, just off Rodney Street. He's the governor of Jamaica at the time. He hanged them both. The repercussion of this was extensive in Britain at the time, because John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, Charles Dickens, Charles Darwin were involved in the debate of the hanging of Gordon. They felt it was murder. Governor Eyre was removed, brought back to Britain, and in fact, John Stuart Mill set up the Jamaica Society to discuss the hanging of Gordon. The fact is that Governor Eyre had supporters. Charles Dickens supported the hanging. So did Carlyle. In fact, to one's surprise, so did some poets at the time supported the hanging of Gordon, whereas Charles Darwin and Huxley and Mills protested at the hanging of Gordon. Now, what is interesting, when William Gladstone became Prime Minister, he gave Governor Eyre back his pension. Because, of course, his father owned 2,508 slaves. So what we have is a history of Bogle, and this is where I'll end, because in the Glasgow documents, one of the things Glasgow is going to do, they admitted that one of their buildings today is built on the house of Robert Bogle from Glasgow. So one of the large buildings in Glasgow University is built on the house of Robert Bogle. Now, Robert Bogle had slave plantations in Jamaica in 1817. Paul Bogle, not just in Jamaica, but in Jamaica, St. Thomas, the area, eastern Jamaica. So Robert Bogle had slave plantations in the east part of Jamaica in St. Thomas in 1817. Paul Bogle was born in St. Thomas, the eastern part of Jamaica, in 1820. They are probably related. Therefore, in fact, I pointed this out to the university, that the national hero of Jamaica, ancestors, come from the west of Scotland. And therefore, in fact, what we have is something I've said before. We're all different, but the same. And therefore, it is a sadness that we are somehow, by the law, by trying to we've used the law to set about distinctions, which allowed us to actually put people into slavery for over 200 years. And I feel that, in fact, Glasgow's decision is a very enlightened one, and I hope, in fact, other institutions will follow suit. Thank you very much.
We have time for probably a couple of questions if anybody would like to pose one.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much indeed for a very, very, very enlightening, if sometimes distressing talk. I'm afraid this is kind of more a kind of advertisement than a question, but I was thinking I'm probably, unfortunately, distantly related to the awful Cunningham in Glasgow built what is now the Gallery of Modern Art, and I was just thinking, what on earth can I do, like the University of Glasgow, to practically make amends? And it just occurred to me, well, unfortunately I can't go because I'm working, but there is an anti-racism conference in Edinburgh on Saturday, the 22nd. Unfortunately, it does clash with the anti-nukes demonstration of His Lane. As I say, very, very sadly, I can't go because of work commitments, but if people want to find out more, the Lighthouse Bookshop up in West Nicholson Street could tell you all, and they've got a website. Hope that was okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Has anybody got a question they'd like to ask or a comment? Okay, just wait for the microphone, thanks.
Thank you for a tremendous lecture. I'd be interested to know what your view is about taking down statues and getting rid of place names that tell this story, because you've used it so touchingly to let us know about the whole of the south of Scotland, really. And if we take away Buchanan from the street name, will that not mean that we'll be encouraged to forget about it even more?
I think you're right. I think that I would rather put up a plaque and to say what the person did, rather than, in fact, remove. I think if you remove the evidence, you remove the crime. And therefore, I feel that the Scottish people, I remember one historian actually said that the reason why, as a historian, he never went into detail about this history and wait for it. He actually said he don't think the Scottish people could take it. And I said that, to me, is a very outrageous assumption. And I think that our historians, if we look at, say, what I've said this morning, it's all there. I've not created any evidence. The evidence is there. The information is there. But somehow one didn't know. And I think it's outrageous to walk down Rodney Street and don't know how many Frenchmen he killed for us. And I think, in fact, and I feel, it's funny, I was reading this thing about genetics, and the very fact that I'm 3% Finnish stroke Shetland has changed my perception of things. And I think that somehow it's not just about how people look. It's like, if the person sitting next to you was 50% black genes, but looked the same, what would you think? And I think that it is not how people themselves think, is what the system says you should think. And that's why people like Boswell, and I had it on a slide, I didn't comment, but Boswell actually defended the right of the slave in Edinburgh to be released. But he still believed that slavery in the Caribbean was just, because it was self-interest and they're used to the sun. Like a man like Boswell could think that sort of thing, and thought his colleague Johnson, who he worked with, Boswell and Johnson, he attacked Johnson for being ignorant, because Johnson supported freedom of slaves. He was ignorant because what Boswell is saying, it's the law. And therefore it's the law in the Caribbean, then we can do it. And thus we have to be very careful of the law, what the law tells us to do, because we believe then that is right and just. And you're absolutely right. I think it is right and just that we change the plaques, although somebody says probably I should be put out of the country for suggesting it. And I have to go defend myself on the 10th of October. But I wouldn't want people knocking down the Gallery of Modern Art. Where would you stop? Knocking down the Dundas statue, digging up Jamaica Street, which has been there from 1763. Closing the necropolis. All these things we just cannot do. knock down Inverest Lodge because it was James Witherburn's house. To me, we should put up plaques, and only put up the truth. We shouldn't put up things which aren't true. So, no, I think we should do that, and anything you could all do to lobby in that behalf, it would help save me a lot of trouble.
Sorry, folks, we have run out of time, but please let's thank Sir Jeff for an amazing talk today.
Thank you. Thank you.